Well, everyone, welcome to our session, Turning a News Story into a Book. We're so happy that you all have decided to give up an hour of your Saturday on a holiday weekend to come join us and, hear a little bit more about the process. And, especially if you're a journalist who has ever worked on a story and said, I really think that this could be a book. So we're hoping to give you some resources, some tips, some insight, some advice, all of that good stuff. So welcome everyone. My name is Ashanti Blaze Hopkins. I'm the president of the SPJ LA chapter. I'm also an associate professor at Santa Monica College in journalism. And I would love to introduce Mindy Marquez, who is going to be on this panel as well. Mindy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. So I am a recovering journalist, if that's ever really a thing. I was a journalist for 30 years. Most of it spent at the Miami Herald, where I was last executive editor and publisher. And I jumped to books 10 months ago at Simon & Schuster. And so where I'm now, I'm having a lot of fun, buying books and editing books and chasing great stories.
That's awesome. So why don't we hop right in? Let's talk a little bit about the process of understanding how a story could actually be a book. Is the story actually worth turning it into a book? How do you kind of get that sense, as a journalist?
And you have a lot of great insight, Ashanti, so I'm going to turn to you a couple times to actually answer some of these questions, since you are a published book author, and so you have a lot of great insight. So I talked, before this, in advance of this meeting, I talked to some of my former colleagues at the Miami Herald who published books from the works, that appeared at the Herald, mostly investigative works. And I also talked to a couple of agents just to get a broader sense beyond my own experience. And the one piece that kept coming up over and over again is that, unlike a story that you might write for the paper, for, your broadcast, a book really has to have a story arc, and it has to have characters. So it has to, have something that propulses, the action from, a beginning, a middle, an end. And really important is character development. I had one of my colleagues had done a project it was called Dirty Gold, and it was really an issues project about how, nefarious characters were using now the gold industry to really launder dirty money. And a lot of it, of course, came through Miami, because of course everything does. But when they went to write the book, they really had to go back, pick 3 characters, and then really tell the story through those 3 characters. And so it was a different kind of reporting, and to really tease out those characters.
It's so important to really remember that whole thing about you're telling a story. So it does need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think so many times in our day-to-day as professional journalists, it's not necessarily what we're thinking about, right? We're thinking about making sure that the information is there and that our audience can easily process and consume it and understand, the nuances of the story that we're trying to tell.
Right.
But it's different, when you're turning something on deadline versus writing a couple of 100 pages of something, even
Exactly.
the process is different.
Exactly. And the other thing I think to consider too, like when you're thinking about, well, do I have a book? Have a book length story to tell, is also, are you the preeminent expert in that field? Like if you were to say, are you like, so knowledgeable that you're one of the few people who can tell that story? And I think about, in this case, Julie Brown, who did the perversion of justice, Epstein investigation, and her book just came out a couple of months ago. And so in that case, you would say, yeah, you know what? She's uniquely positioned, to really write that story. And other people have written Epstein stories, but she had done so much reporting. She had lived with it for so long. She had a relationship with the victims from the start. So she had a lot of things that made her uniquely positioned. And in that case, it wasn't just developing the characters, but she had to put herself in it. So it was kind of a little bit part memoir, part like how we got the story and the story itself. So that's just another thing to think about too. And also like, do you have a ton of questions still? Like you just finished this project, but I feel like there's a bunch more information or there's just so much more to do here. Or that can be told, could be another indicator that you might have something that could work as a book.
I know we talked before about, how much you really have to love the subject matter when you're
Yes.
going to embark on writing a book, because the process itself can be daunting, it can be intimidating,
Yeah.
and sometimes you may feel like, I don't want to do this anymore. Why did I sign up for this? Right?
Right. You know, Ashani, I mean, I almost wanted to ask you. I loved when we talked about this, and you talked about, the process of writing a proposal. And I mean, everyone would has probably at least heard or knows that you really have to have a pretty decent proposal to first get through the gate with the agents, and then get to ultimately an editor who's going to read it. But and we could talk a lot about this, but I would love for you to share your experience with the proposal, because it's so key. It really is so key. Like I would say that the one thing that doesn't work is like, don't send me an email with a paragraph that says, hey, I covered blankety blank for 3 years. You think I could turn this into a book? Because honestly, if you didn't take the time to think about it, I can't kind of chew through it for you. But you had to go through the process of writing a proposal, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's so different than and I think probably the closest thing that you do as a working journalist on a day-to-day basis is when you're pitching stories to do, in a news meeting or a production meeting or what have you. But that's not what this is at all.
right,
And when you get into higher education, you're approached by a lot of publishers to write books, either a textbook or a subject matter book. And so when I was approached to write a textbook specifically about producing campus media, I had to put together a proposal, and it had to be very specific, right? It had to be kind of an overview of what I thought, the textbook could be, why I thought it was needed,
right.
were there gaps in what was already out there? And then I had to break down what I wanted to cover per each chapter. So, chapter one, this I think could be a working title for chapter one, and then bullet pointed all of the things that I would probably cover in the chapter, and then go to chapter two and do the same thing, and then on and so on. And so I will say that it's not only needed for the publisher to understand this is what you're trying to write, and they could envision it and see kind of the finished product in their mind's eye, but also as you're writing the book, it is kind of your blueprints that you keep going back to, especially, when you have those days where you don't feel like writing, or you're like, maybe there's nothing else in my head about this subject matter. You go
Right.
right back to that proposal, and then you remind yourself, okay, that's right. I wanted to cover this, this, and this. And then that way it becomes much easier to approach the process of writing a book, and to not make it feel so intimidating. My dad always used to tell me, whenever I was facing something that seemed daunting, he would always ask me, Ashanti, how do you eat an elephant? And I was like,
Right.
what are you talking about? And he's like, one bite at a time. You don't have to eat the whole thing at once. And it's the same with writing books. You can take it little by little by little by little. And eventually you have an entire book and it's finished, right? Um, I know we also talked about just the confidence level. I remember telling you that when I turned in the first chapter of the book that I wrote, I remember finishing it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is garbage. This is trash. I am going to get killed by my editors. My publisher's going to hate this. And we had the meeting, and they said, we read the first chapter. And I was like, mm-hmm. And they were like, we think it's really good. And I just remember feeling like, huh? Really? You sure? So it's you finish that first chapter and it gives you the confidence to keep going,
Yeah.
right?
And the reality is that as journalists, we're not really used to, unless you're working on enterprise or investigative work, like writing an outline for stories is not a thing that we normally do. We sit, we write it, we turn it, even, weekenders or whatever you write, but we don't really, unless like I can say from my experience at the Herald for many years, we did that more when it was a big investigation, and even then, I can tell you that it was not like a proposal. It was like maybe it would be a couple of pages, but proposals range anywhere from, as you know, I mean, I think a good listen. I've gotten proposals as long as 150 pages, and I think that's probably too much. But I think a good proposal generally is at least 50, is about 50 pages long. And why? Because, like you said, it has a very substantive summary of your vision for the book. And then it has an outline and a chapter outline on how you see the book unfolding. And then it has a bio about yourself, like why are you uniquely qualified to write this? What's your expertise? What's the audience you think you can bring for the book? Because remember, we're trying to sell books too. And so, and a writing sample. I think a writing sample is really key. You and I were talking. I said I got a proposal recently, and it didn't have a chapter outline, and I ended up passing because I was concerned that the writer had not really thought through the structure and what the narrative arc was. I mean, understood the characters, but not how those characters were going to interact and how we were going to tell the story over, 250, 300, 350 pages. So I think that's important too. And you need that to pick your agent, which we may want to talk a little bit about. I know for you, they came to you, so that was easy, right?
Yeah, right. No hard work on this end.
Right. So they actually came to you, and then you decided who you wanted to work with.
Yeah.
And when I spoke to get some feedback from the agents, and we have a resource that I'm gonna be able to share, and it's a 1-pager that was shared with me with an agent, Sarah Yakes, who does mostly fiction, I think. But anyway, I think it's a really great list of like where to look for agents.
I'll go ahead and pop the link in the chat right now, and then I'll pop it in again at the end.
Okay. But one thing is, I think, don't blast every agent, right? I think be a little judicious in how you want to approach the agents. One idea that actually came from one of the agents was, if you have a couple of books that you really admire and you really love the topic resonates, or you love the style, look at the acknowledgments in the back, which that's where they thank their agents, most writers, and see who represented that book. And so that's one way that you could target, who might be a good fit for you, and who's accepting submissions, and then they would work with you to help refine your pitch. And some people, stylistically, some people might give you samples of proposals that were successful, or they might give you, point you to other places. But there's a lot of resources on that list that I think are great. And another resource that I have found valuable, I've suggested to a couple of people, is Masterclass. I don't know if anybody's, for about $180 a year, right? You have all this access to a bunch of great classes, but there's a lot of good writers on Masterclass who are giving, lectures on how to write, and so that could be a really great, I think it's probably worth the investment, to be honest, because it's top people who've been, published and talk about how to do it, which is different, I think, than different, but, similar, but, you stretch different muscles, when you're trying to turn a yarn into a book.
We were talking earlier about how the difference between the editing process, between when you're a working journalist and you have to submit something to either an editor or producer to copy edit or edit before it hits the air, versus, the process of an editor with a publishing company editing your piece. Can you talk a little bit about, what you look for in the type of notes that you give, as someone who's reading through these books?
Yeah, so I may be, because I was a journalist so recently, and so many of our editors are former journalists. I think we might stylistically at Simon & Schuster be a little bit different, but a lot of the feedback. So here's the thing that I think is a little bit surprising: there is not a fact-checking process in books. right? And that is a little bit, there is copy editing, but there's not fact checking. So for instance, Julie Brown said, I found that I had to really be way more careful in my own reporting and writing and double checking because it was more on me to make sure. Now I told you I just finished editing like a 500-page manuscript by an excellent author, but I found myself, Googling thing, just to double check, but I think that's my journalist thing. But the feedback I've gotten from so many, and I think you yourself shared, Shanti, is that, the hard work, I think there is really, if you invest in that proposal and you really have a really good idea of what you're doing there, that is so helpful. I mean, I edited the manuscript twice before handing it back. Once, I would say for the big picture, right? Is the narrative working? Is the propulsion, is it lagging anywhere? Are there holes in the story? Does the general argument stand up? Because, a good book has a general argument that's presented in the prologue. Like, this is what I'm laying out to convince you, reader. I'm trying to tell you how to read my book in the prologue, and I'm going to tell you what my big idea is, and then how I'm going to execute on it. And I just finished my 9-year term, my 9-year term on the Pulitzer board, which is really where I learned to read books critically. And that would be my approach. I would say, after reading the prologue and saying, okay, what is the big idea? What is the big thesis, if you will, and do they sustain it? Do they carry it out? Do they hit it in the end? That was one of the ways to evaluate the work. So I think that's the other thing to think about. Like, what is it that you're trying to achieve in this work? What is it that you really want to say and convey? And if you can crystallize that. So anyway, my first edit is to look at that, right? Big picture. And then the second edit, and this is just the first round, because it's going to come back to me. You should speak about that because you've been through it, because it's not like a one and done edit,
No.
like be with your editor. It's definitely a multi-round, a multi-round process. But I before handing it back to the author, I read it a second time, and I was more like, I was looking for how to tighten and eliminate some clauses and checking some facts. And because the writer was a good writer, it was a more difficult process. I had to surgically edit in a way that there's other times that you can just take chunks out of and I really didn't find a lot of chunks to take out. So that's just my approach. I think my colleagues are pretty hands-on, but I don't think that's the case in other houses, to be honest. From what I've heard, the feedback I've heard from some of my colleagues who published books, and you should talk about your experience, because
Yeah, I found the editing process as a working journalist with my producers or editors to be a lot more extensive, and a lot more brutal, to be honest, than working with a book publisher and working with the editors with the publisher. I feel like a lot of times they understand that you are the expert, or they wouldn't have purchased your book in the first place. And so they are leaning on you a lot to make sure that you understand that the information that you're putting in is accurate, it's correct, it's up to date, all of
Right.
those things. And then they're really just drilling down on like kind of the minor details and making sure all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted when it comes to grammar and all of those types of things. So, I feel like the process of going through editing as a professional journalist over prepares you for going through the editing process if you're writing a book, because I think time and time again, I was like, that's it? You sure? There's nothing else, because I'll change it if you need me to, so it's often even trying to get past that, to get out of your own head and say, okay, this is good. Like, it's okay. They're giving me the feedback. And it takes a couple of rounds. Like, I don't think there was one chapter I wrote that it was just like, here you go. And they were like, okay, just make these edits and it's great. It takes a couple of rounds, before it's okay, this is good to go. Let's put this chapter to bed, on to the next chapter. Which is
You know,
also a good thing that you know, you really do work on it chapter by chapter a lot of the times instead of just like write the entire book and hand it in. You know, a lot of times you can go chapter by chapter unless for some reason you already have a manuscript written and you've submitted
right,
it like that.
right,
Yeah.
right. And I think, I think your comments point to something else I think people really need to have top of mind, which is that it is a long process. And so I think it can take 18 months from end to end. And that's if you're ready, like honestly, if you because for production purposes, we need 9 months. We need 9 months from the point of where I turn in a fully edited, to then start copy editing, typeset that. And COVID, to be honest, has really put a lot of pressure on the actual print process and paper supply and all those things that nobody really needs to know about. But so when you think about what you're pitching, you also have to think, it's like when you're working at a paper or a TV station or anywhere, you have the dailies and then you have the weekenders. And then if you're working on a project, you're thinking, okay, when I land this in a year, will this be relevant? And so you have to think about that with your books. With a book, you have to think 2 years out at least. You have to say, 2 years out, is this going to matter? Or will the moment have passed? Will this still resonate? Or, if you're talking about, if you're, well, I don't, if I one example that I think it was a very good proposal that I received that was really talking about, the soldier, the Americans who were converted to, to support the Taliban, et cetera. But at the moment, we had shifted to our like homegrown terrorism, right? And the focus had shifted. People were, and think about now, if that book, if I had purchased that book and now we're out of Afghanistan where it's not, right? So it was a great proposal. It was very well done, but in terms of timing, I don't think it was gonna work. So you have to think about that too, because the timeline is so long. And Ashanti, as you experience, firsthand, you tell a journalist, hey, you've got a year to write a book, and they think, woohoo, but
that year goes by very quickly. It goes by very quickly. And then next thing you know, you're like, oh my gosh, I have all these chapters due and I haven't really started because I thought I had a year, right? And so, yeah, the process is long. I think just the writing took me 8 months, but from the time I was approached by the publisher to the time I wrote the proposal, to the time, we got all that shored up, to the time I started writing and then finishing the book, it was probably about 16 months, right? From that first time that they approached me to the time that it was actually finished, right? So yeah, it is a marathon. It is not a sprint. It is not a sprint by any means. I do see we have some questions that Victoria has posted. So I'm going to read this here. How important is it to have some of the writing already done before reaching out to agents? For example, is a proposal and chapter outline enough at the initial stage, or should you aim to have the first 3 chapters ready to go as well so you can prove to an agent that you can actually do this? I know this can vary by genre, so curious specifically for journalistic type books.
So I would say, I don't know that you have to have 3 chapters done, but I think you have to give them a writing sample. And not just your clips, right? Because that's not a book. So I think what you want to really show, and so many, depending on the genre, you can live and die by the writing. So I would say memoir, it's got to be beautifully written. It's got to be beautifully written because, unless you're I don't know, a celebrity or a big name, like what is you may have a powerful story, but it's got to be just exquisitely told. For journalism books, you just have to show that you can carry, right? That you can write well, that you're a good writer. Obviously, good writing is required, and that you can carry, So I would say at least one chapter, a sample chapter, and I think that summary where you're pitching your book, has to be in really good shape too. But I think they want to see that you can, and they'll work with you. Like once they buy into either your idea, because sometimes they'll buy into the writer and they might say, Shanti, I'm not sure that's the idea, but we really like you and your writing styles. So let's work on something and see if we can, come up with something that, would be marketable.
Yeah. Yeah. Victoria had a second question that I'm going to go ahead and read. You mentioned the importance of the story arc, beginning, middle, end. What if you were working on a long-term investigation that may not have a clear ending? What is the best advice in that scenario? Is it better to wait, say 5 years, so you can say 5 years later, here's the result, or what other options might there be?
No, I don't think you have to wait. I just think you have a general thesis, right? You have a general, like, even when we do investigative stories, we kind of have a sense of what it is that we're gonna find, in the end. And so I think as long as it's clear that you have command of the topic and that you've done enough reporting, that you can finish it. Because, for instance, I've gotten proposals that to me, a red flag is a proposal that says, and I will report and I will find out, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, if you don't have enough here, that you've shown me that you have enough reporting done, that you can at least get the general, tackle the general thesis, then I'm gonna see it as a red flag. So somewhere in the middle, I know that sounds like it's like a Goldilocks thing. I think you want to do enough reporting that you've got a great, it's like journal, like, you're onto something, and you may not know exactly how it concludes. Because listen, your outline might change, the story might change, but the general contours, are there. So I did buy a book by a former colleague, and the chapter outline, they've been on the road now 8 months reporting. And you know what? The chapter outline has changed a little bit, but it's kind of holding, right? And some things are more important than others, and they're tweaking it as they go, because they're using it, as an outline. And so they're tweaking it as they go. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be rigid, but it means that you're going to, you have enough to prove your general thesis. If I'm calling it a thesis, obviously you don't want it to read like a thesis, Lord knows, but your general argument.
Yeah, I will say that, if I look back at my original proposal for my book, there were definitely some tweaks. There were times when I was like, well, maybe actually this chapter probably needs to be before this chapter, because
Right.
then it makes more sense sequentially, right? And so it's one of those things where if you at least have a blueprint, if you at least have a map, you can always throw that out and like or tweak it, and you know what I mean? But you got to start
Right.
with a blueprint.
Right.
I couldn't even imagine how difficult it would have been to write the book without any kind of proposal or outline or anything.
Right.
I think I would have been all over the
Check-ins,
place.
right? And I try to have regular check-ins with my authors, and depending on where they are in the process. And so that can also help, again, as long as you have something to work from, like an outline, like a blueprint for the book, then you could talk through certain things, and then things will change. And yeah, I think actually you should, and honestly, it helps to do that pre-work before somebody sits down and starts to write.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it is, I think at one point I was probably talking to my editor like twice a week.
Right.
Whether I had a chapter coming up that was due within a day or two or not, but just kind of being like, okay, what's going on? Is everything good? What are you thinking? Is this chapter developing the way you thought it would? Do we need to make any tweaks? So yeah, that relationship becomes very important.
Yeah.
During the process of finishing the book. Yeah. There is a question in the chat. Mindy, what kind of books do you particularly agent for or consider?
Agents. Well, you know what? Agents are like editors, and they have, like, everybody kind of has their own, they have things that they specialize in, or genres. So that's why you really have to look for something that matches your what you're trying to do. So there are agents who only do fiction, and then even in general nonfiction and journalism driven books, there will be a genre. And if you look them up, somebody you're interested in, you can see they will tell you what they're interested and what they're not interested in. So somebody might be interested in, science fiction, sci-fi type of fiction. And then So I know that's not a thing I'm gonna be interested in. So, you know, but I'm more interested in, and I'm gonna do a little bit of fiction, but I'm mostly doing general nonfiction. But you know, literary fiction is probably where I'm interested in. I know that I'm interested in stories that really tackle the issue of like cultural dislocation and feeling other, and you know, and I think fiction is a really wonderful way to tackle that. So you have to look at the ages because they don't all, there's some of them are specialized. So that's why I think doing your homework on the agents is really key.
Yeah. Let me go to the Q&A because we have a couple of questions in here. Jake Kavanaugh, great advice, Ashanti. Mindy, thank you. Can you talk about trends and interests at Simon & Schuster, Mindy, in terms of topics or narrative containers? What might be some of your suggestions for issue or investigative oriented topics in terms of approaches outside of centering on primary characters?
You know, I think we're kind of open for so many things. I could talk. If you look at our, you know, each of the editors has like a little bio, and we talk about the kind of books that we're buying. And so when I talk to agents and I try to introduce myself and say, this is what I'm interested in, I always talk about my experience as a journalist, and of course, you know, also on the Pulitzer board. And that really opened my mind up to genres that I might not have previously been that interested in. But it, you know, because it forced me to read things that I might not have naturally gravitated to. So I talk about books that I found just incredibly powerful. For instance, and this is, I'm going to throw out the highest bar possible, sorry. But so if you haven't read Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, like, then go get that book. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Didn't win, but anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah. It was listed as one of the 10 best pieces of journalism in the last whatever, you know, century, and whatever list that came out. And what it did, it married incredibly detailed, you know, reporting with novelistic storytelling, and took us to the slums of Mumbai. And you learned something you didn't even think you needed to know, right? And I think that it's an approach that can work with so many of the topics that are so, right, that we're grappling with right now. So obviously, you know, when you think about, you know, racial issues, when you think about, you know, immigration, when you think about, like nobody wants to read an eat your peas story. So if she could have done a thing that said, here's the geopolitical, you know, the impact of globalization on, you know, we were going to read that. But oh my God, you get invested in these characters. And so you see on a granular level how they're impacted by the very, you know, poverty and, you know, like I said, the impact of globalization. So and all of a sudden, like you're there, you're invested. The other book that I always mention is called Devil in the Grove, and it did win a Pulitzer Prize, Gilbert King. And it did something, it's a book of history, but it does what I love. It went back in history to teach us something about the current moment. It actually they were able to unearth something. He was able to unearth new material. And it was also a biography of Thurgood Marshall at a point in time. It was like it was a horrible case in Florida, you know, where several young men were unjustly accused and killed, right? And so, you know, anyway, that book did something so, like I said, it's not trying to be a full biography of Thurgood Marshall, but it takes us and, you know, it shows us Thurgood Marshall, like in this critical moment, handling an incredibly difficult case, a very important case, and how kind of you see then where he goes later, you understand him better. And it's just chilling. So that's another book, is absolutely a piece of investigative and historical, you know, work, but it is incredibly powerful. So just for myself, like I'm interested in a wide swath of things. I've purchased the book that I told my former colleagues, the first book I bought is a book that you would say is environmental. They are traveling across the country in an Airstream, and they are chronicling these really interesting experiments to try to bring certain North American birds back from the brink of extinction. And the backdrop is this jarring report that came out like 5 years ago that said North America had lost 3 billion birds. So we're in a crisis. But what I loved about that book was it is sounding the alarm bell, right? Like we're in a moment where, like, if we lose bird, it's literally the canary in the coal mine, right? Birds and what they mean for us with the environment, but it's also hopeful because there are some things that are happening that are incredibly cool that I personally had never heard about. And so this book is going to be a combination of those two things. I bought a political book that is going to look at Biden's 4 years in office, and we're hoping to publish that probably, early the year of the next presidential elections. I purchased a memoir that is just a really beautiful. It's very powerful, and I get a lot of memoir, but most of it's really hard to hit the bar with memoir because, like I tell you, the writing has to be the story has to be incredibly powerful and unique, and then it has to also be like beautifully written. But this is like a cross between Glass Castles and Blindside, and so I'm really excited about that. And the book that I was just editing, which will be my first book to come out next year, is a biography of Cuban opposition leader Oswaldo Paya, and it's David Hoffman, who won a Pulitzer Prize, and he's a Washington Post journalist. And what he's doing in that book, I think, is that he's telling the long story of Cuba's struggle with democracy, but he's also gives such an insider view of what it is to try to fight a totalitarian government from the inside. And he brings that history to the present, where I think so many of the stories are stuck in the 1959 and Bay of Pigs. So that's a long answer to say just what personally I've purchased. And so my interest is pretty eclectic and hard to pin. Less self-helpy books. I guess I'm not that much into self-help type of books, but.
Okay, there's a couple more questions we have. This one from Smith. I realize the session is about publishers and agents, but what do you think of the self-publishing world? Any advice in that regard?
I'm not as familiar with that. What I know that that's a path for some people. I'm biased, obviously, because I'm in this world, but I would say at least try to find a publisher first before going the self-publishing route, because what a publisher brings, and it's really difficult to do on your own, is the power of a big company to do the marketing and publicity. And you can't underestimate that. I mean, if your book is sitting there on Amazon competing with, thousands upon thousands of titles, how do you really make it stand out? And even now, I will tell you, one of the things that was shocking to me in the book world is like how little some books sell, like 500 copies, and that the majority of books don't make money, right? And so it's the big titles that let us do the other things, right? It's like the Stephen Kings and the oh my God, how can I blank on his name? He's a signature author. Anyway, the Watergate type, books. Those are the books that help us. And so to take a chance on the books that may not be, of course, we always go into it thinking that, we go with a plan, that each book is going to be a commercial success. And like I said, we put our publicity and marketing behind every book. It has an actual budget for every book to push it. So that's why I might try that first before saying, okay, I'm going to publish it anyway, because I feel like it needs to be out there. But I would try first to try to get, because there's some smaller publishing houses that might publish something that maybe one of the big five might not tackle.
Okay, let's go to Laura's question. Do I need to get professional training before trying to write a book? I'm a journalist, but should I take a class specifically for book writing, or do I not need to? Should I just go for it?
I mean, I think you would probably need to understand where you feel like how you feel about where you're at and with your abilities. I would say it cannot hurt to invest, a couple of hours of your time to like I said, those master classes. Someone in the chat said they had done them and found them helpful. A book that's often recommended is the Stephen Keen's on writing book, which I'm trying to look over here because I have it somewhere. But so there's and the resource list has a couple of those books. But if you, for instance, if you've tackled in your career deep enterprise stories or investigative pieces that are multi-part, then I think you probably are better equipped to write a book. But I think it's like you don't have to. I don't know. You have to go and get your master's in in fine art. In fine arts to do it. Unless you're going to go to fiction, then I'd say maybe it's worth it. But I think it would be very good to at least invest a couple hours in either reading something that helps you think about the structure of a book.
Yeah, I can also say too, to that question, I don't think I ever thought that I could write a book before I wrote a book. And I think sometimes, we underestimate ourselves and what we have the ability to do. Chances are, if you're writing on a regular basis, you could probably get to a place where you can write a book. Right.
Right.
But I think, yes, those master classes could be very helpful. But don't underestimate yourself is what I would say. Don't underestimate the power of your ability to be a writer, because it's literally what you do on a day-to-day basis if you're a professional journalist. This may be just a different type of writing, but you're a writer, right? So, I mean, I would say, do one of those master classes if that's what's going to give you that confidence, and then go for it. Right.
Yeah.
Use the author's resource guide that we the link that we put in the chat, look over that, and then, figure out kind of your path forward. But I also see that Rebecca Aguilar in the chat said, she thinks that everybody has a book inside them. I 100% believe that. I tell my students that all the time. Everyone has a book in their head. Everyone. Whether it's a good book is another story. But,
well, there's that. Right? Whether it's a general audience book too.
Right.
But I think you're right. What you're saying is you also don't want to get to a point where you're so stymied by the process that you don't even,
you don't even try.
Most of us, right? We just got to sit down and write. I used to call my first draft. I was just say, look, just make it a vomitola stat, man. Just put it on and then fix it. But at least you have something on the page. And I think that if you at least try to do that summary, that very meaty summary and the outline, then if you find like you're having trouble with that, then maybe seek specific resources for it. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. Don't also do research, but don't get so stuck in the research that you don't actually do the thing.
Yeah, the writing.
Right.
The words.
You're right.
Right. Okay, Rebecca has a question. Do you have to find a book agent to pitch your story idea to you, or do you take the idea straight from the journalist?
So this is a tricky one. So I would say generally, as an organization, we don't take unsolicited manuscripts, right? Unless they come from an agent. So that means, why is that? Why would we as an organization? Because, the agents do a lot of work, right? They're the first kind of filter, and they also work hand in hand with journalists, with authors, I'm saying journalists, but anyway, hand in hand to hone the proposal to, I talked, like I said, my former colleagues who did the Dirty Gold talked about how they had to rewrite their proposal, a couple of times and get it to a point where then it could be presented to a book editor. Now, having said that, I have actually approached many journalists or people who I think have a great story, and I am asking them, have you thought about a book? Have you thought about turning this into a book? But I'm also careful. Do you have an agent? Well, if you're going to go find one, then please let them know that you and I just talked for 3 hours, because I have two books that I bought that it was my idea, right? Because I went to say Ashanti and I said, you know what, Ashanti, I just read your, 3-part piece on da 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 da. I think actually it could be a book if we did da 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 da. Are you interested in writing a book? Okay, okay. So now let's go to an agent who, because from my perspective, I don't want to also like, give you my idea and then it's shopped to another editor, in another house, right? Because now I've invested. So I have done that and work with some, some agents that I trust, or I could recommend some people. So I have done some of that, and I'm on a case by case basis. I have some former colleagues who have given me some sample chapters, and it's hard to get to them. I am going to get to them, but I also have to read the proposals that are coming in through the official channels. So I try to create a balance to give feedback to certain people. Obviously, I'm very, I want to be very cognizant that I want to try to, be available to people and talk to people. I've talked to a bunch of people about like they've had ideas. I'll do that, but I'm kind of hemming and hawing here because I can't say I'm going to take everybody's, unfiltered ideas, but I do that on a case by case basis because I obviously want to cast a wide net and I want to help people who don't feel like they have access to at least get access to the process. And I did put my email earlier in the chat. Just know, like I said, I this weekend I hope to get through hopefully 2 of my unofficial pile, right? The friends pile, the friends and colleagues pile, so I can give them feedback, and hopefully I'll find something fabulous that way.
Let's go to Frederick. He asks, the public is pretty litigious and reporters do get sued. What happens when the characters in your book sue you? Does the publisher help at all with legal defense?
You know what? I haven't really obviously had that. I know that mostly all the books go through are reviewed by an attorney beforehand, and so they might flag any issues. There's also, we do things like we have permissions. So for instance, unlike journalism, we have legal forms that we give people. So if your book is based on 5 key sources, those people would fill out these forms and saying, yes, I did do interviews with Ashanti and she's going to use me for a book, and I'm very aware of that. So there's some small micro steps that are taken before the book is published, and most importantly that it is reviewed by legal before they're published. But I don't know if I have to say I just don't know if it works like in a newsroom where if you get sued, right, for something that I have to think that, quite frankly, I'd have to think that yes, we'd have to I'd have to think it, but I just don't, I can't answer that knowingly right now.
Okay, Smith has a question. What kind of money can an author expect to get on a book? What's it based on?
Wow, so it is it really ranges wildly. But I will say that every I put together a P&L for profit and losses for every book. We all do. And so it's based on how many copies are sold, what we think we can sell in hardcover, in paperback, and audio. If you're a first-time author and you don't really have, and you're a first-time author and you don't have a huge following, right? You're not a celebrity, you're not an athlete, you're not, you're kind of and you don't have, whatever, 5 million followers on Instagram, then that's going to influence, right? The money situation, because you're not going to be able to get, it's a risk. Because I think what I just shared is the shocking thing that I learned is that, 80% of books don't make money. I mean, I'm probably undershooting. So we have to calculate that every time we think about buying a book. Can we find an audience for this book? Can the author help us find the audience for this book? And so that's part of it. Now, I think, some books you hear of reports of books getting, 7 figures, and that happens. And that's not just, celebrities or, but it could be people who have, like I said, they have a platform and they can use that platform to help sell the book. So it really ranges. Fiction is much more difficult. I'm going to say it's much more difficult to break out a first-time author in fiction than general nonfiction. So that's something to also keep in mind. I mean, again, I thought fiction was the thing that right? Like you have this romantic idea. It's fake, but yeah, it's like, some pillar authors in the fiction world that carry and again allow us to really try to break out some of the first time authors. That fiction is even more difficult because it's with general nonfiction, sometimes the topic can help, right? Like if it's newsy or you get it, the whole thing is like, can you get it reviewed? Is it, can you get it in front of the right people? Can they talk about it? All that. So it really varies very widely to, I would say, 5 figures to the, to 7 figures. But I think if you're a first time author, you're going to be in the lower end of that for sure.
Yeah, I don't make a ton of money off of my book. I mean, like the checks are nice when they come, but it's like, okay.
Yeah, and then royalties, right.
Yeah.
And the way it usually works too, I don't know if the way it usually works is if we sign a contract, generally authors are paid in four payments. The first payment is when you sign the contract. The second payment is generally when we have a finished manuscript and we're almost ready to go. The third payment is when the hardcover comes out, and the fourth payment that's how the advance is chunked out. And then the fourth one is when the paperback comes out. And then of course there's royalties that will come, and royalties kick in if you've kind of earned the advance so that your book has sold enough to cover what you got, the first chunk that you got in the first place. So it's a very it's fascinating to me that every single book has a P&L.
Yeah. Haston has a question. I love that name, by the way. Haston says, how do you decide if a book idea will appeal to a broad enough audience to merit publication? If the idea is too niche, are there ways to help it appeal to a bigger audience?
I think that's just a key part of every conversation when you're thinking, when I get a proposal, that's really a key part of that, right? Like you have to think, who's the audience and can you broaden the audience enough? I mean, now I have to approach it from the perspective as an editor at Simon & Schuster, right? Which is different than if I was at a smaller house. So we're more of a general audience book publisher. So I have to think about it in that way, whereas it might be a great book for a smaller, the other day I was talking to somebody, I said, you might want to think about a university press for that specific book because they might actually pick that up, whereas it might not work for us. So it's really a part of every time we're thinking about a book. And so it's something that you should think about as an author, because it's kind of an argument that you're going to need to make to first an agent and then to an editor ultimately, like, this is who I see as my audience. Now, here's a thing that makes me crazy. For instance, there are, 1 million Hispanics and who, speak Spanish, and this book will appeal to them. So if I can get 10% of them, I'm going to sell, 100. No, you're not. You're like, listen, if you could sell 100,000 copies, so don't do that kind of like, oh, there are this many police officers. And so if I'm writing about law enforcement, then of course this percentage of law enforcement is going to want well, no, that's not how it works. So don't do that kind of math. But do think about and I think about it all the time. Sometimes the books are too niche and I just don't think that I'm going to be able to find a broad enough audience for, in terms of, general interest. And it's a little bit like that editor instinct, it's hard to quantify sometimes, but some of my colleagues have been doing it for years, and they're really like, that's no, that's not gonna sell. And then they tamp down my enthusiasm.
Well, listen, we have 5 more minutes. We don't have any additional questions in the Q&A section at this point. I'm wondering if we can maybe just have some closing words, some advice that Mindy, that you wanted to impart to folks who are thinking about venturing into this world of publishing or finding an agent or what have you. Kind of what parting advice would you give?
So I mean, I guess it's like the Nike commercial. I would say, like, just do it. Right now we're at a really exciting point in the book publishing industry, which is where we are really working to really expand and diversify the voices that we're publishing. And I can say that I am really proud to work at Simon & Schuster, where Dana Kennedy, who was the administrative public, and the first Black woman to be a publisher, and then she hired me. And then she hired, Lashara Bunting, another Black woman and former journalist. And then she hired Yadon Israel, a really young and super energetic editor who's also Black. So what I'm trying to say that she came in, she's not just words, she hired a bunch of us to help do that. And it doesn't mean that it's all we're gonna do, but it does mean that we're really looking, and it's not just Simon & Schuster, I think in everywhere. So it's an opportunity to really try to increase the diversity of voices, and not just ethnic and racial, but, geographic and topical. So much is, I'm based in Miami, and the reason that I'm based in Miami is because she wanted, and actually so is Lashara, and she wanted to have people not just in the Acela corridor, right? Because you're in the West Coast, and so often, it's everything is just dictated by this New York point of view. So even geographic perspective, LGBTQ, disability, there's just so many different things, aspects to diversity that we'd like to do. So I'd say, and I would just say, it's a time where I think people are really looking to do it for real. We've heard this before, but I think that there's a real commitment, and I know there's a real commitment at Simon & Schuster, because I think I'm proof of that by who and my publisher is proof of that. So I would say it's a really great time to try to maybe dust off things that you didn't think would work in the past that could work now.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I want to echo this whole idea of, I didn't know I could write a book until I wrote a book. And I think that probably is the same for a lot of people. If you push yourself to just put pen to paper and to, learn about the process, but then to start somewhere, you may surprise yourself, right?
Yeah.
You may surprise yourself and end up getting your book, purchased and published. And that's the ultimate goal. So I think I would say, give yourself some credit, believe in yourself, and just like Mindy said, just do it.
Yeah, that's great advice, especially for somebody like you that has actually done it, So yeah, there's nothing like, look, not everything is going to be necessarily a bestseller. I told you want to be clear-eyed, but I think, like everything in life, if you don't know, if you don't try. I didn't even know this could be a possible second act for me after a career that I loved in journalism. And yet I can tell you publishers love journalists because we respect deadlines, we make deadlines, we write better than the average bear, so there's all these things that really do give journalists a leg up in the publishing world.
Absolutely. Well, I want to say thank you, everyone, for attending. I was really blown away to see at max 27 attendees. I think that's amazing for a Saturday on a holiday weekend. And so
yes.
I hope you all got a lot out of this. Again, I'm going to put the link to the author's resources guide in the chat one last time so that you guys can click on that and download that. And I hope all of you have a wonderful and safe, happy, and healthy holiday weekend. Thanks so
And
much.
thank you, Shanti. You're awesome. It's great to partner with you.
Thank you, Mindy. So are you. I'm so glad we were paired together.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Have a good one.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.